Greetings, globeheads and flatards. Let's imagine for a moment that you were the only thing that existed in the entire universe. And let's imagine that in this scenario, you don't need food or water or air or anything. You can survive without anything. And you alone exist. There are no stars, there are no planets, there are no other atoms other than you in this universe that is a infinite expanse of nothingness in all directions. Now, in this infinite black expanse of nothingness in all directions, let's imagine that you are moving in a straight line. You're not accelerating, you're not decelerating, you're not turning, but you're just moving in a straight line at hundreds of thousands of miles an hour. How would you know? How would you know that you were moving? With no reference point, there'd be no way to know. And in fact, if you want to make the conversation a little bit more esoteric, you could actually ask yourself, would you really be moving at all? If there's nothing to measure yourself against, there's no reference point, are you really moving? Because you could only measure that movement or even detect it if there was some point to reference to. Something moving away from you, something moving toward you, or you could actually experience the acceleration of changing in direction or changing in speed. Now, flat earthers seems that they don't understand this whole concept of relativism when it comes to movement. Um, you know, I work very, very close to the Houston airport, one of the airports in Houston. We have multiple. But this is a major hub for the United States, one of the biggest hubs of all. Um, and it used to be that I got off work at 4:30 every day, which just so happens to be the exact same time that the Royal Dutch Airlines KLM flight from Houston to Amsterdam would leave every day. It left at 4:30 sharp. And in the amount of time that it took it to taxi and take off down the runway and get into the air and get up over the freeway was about the same amount of time that it took me to get to my car, get out of the parking lot, and get onto the freeway. And so pretty much every single day at the exact same time, this giant blue and white KLM Boeing 747 would come rumbling right over the top of my car as I was on the freeway. Now, as I was driving down this freeway, there might be a guy next to me in another car, and he might be on his cell phone, and I could look over there and almost read his lips. And I felt like sometimes if I rolled down the window, I could reach out and touch his car. Now I'm going 70 miles an hour down the freeway, and so is he, but we're right next to each other. Same speed, same direction, and it's almost relative to him, it's almost as if I'm not moving. Meanwhile, I'm looking at this giant Boeing 747, which seems to just hang in the air like a kite. It's hardly moving at all. But as a matter of fact, that thing's going like 200 miles an hour because it has to be to get off that runway and to get up into the air. But it's so big and so massive, my brain doesn't want to calculate how far away it is. It seems closer than it is. And so therefore, my brain is tricked into thinking it's moving slower than it is, as it takes longer to move across my field of vision at a further distance. But it's a massive plane. While I'm paying attention to all of this, I almost miss the cop sitting on the median. And as I go flying past him, that's when I realize how fast I'm going in relation to him, because he's parked. And so I kind of freak out and look down at my speedometer. About that time, a motorcycle goes flying around us like I'm sitting still, just about blows my doors off. And I'm no longer worried about the cop because now he's after the motorcycle. In all these cases, the speed is, we detect it differently because how it relates to us or how it relates to other objects. In this entire scenario, the thing that's moving fastest is this giant 747 up overhead, but it sure seems like it's moving a lot slower than that motorcycle. It's not. Human beings aren't as good as we think we are at detecting these sorts of things. In fact, there's nothing in us that is designed to detect speed at all. Now, flat earthers don't understand this. And they'll often say, well, if the earth is spinning and all this stuff, how come I've never felt it? I always joke, have you ever tried tequila? But, of course, I don't drink and I don't recommend anybody else does. But there was a time when I did and I felt the earth spin. Of course, I know that's not literal. But, getting back to seriousness, the motion is not something the human body can detect. We detect acceleration. We detect when things speed up, when things slow down, when things change direction abruptly. Those are the things we detect. When you're flying along in an airplane, you're in an aluminum tube going through the sky at 550 miles an hour, and you don't feel 550 miles an hour of motion. In fact, they'll let you take off your seatbelt and walk around, go to the restroom and all that, when they'll never let you do it on the tarmac when you're moving extremely slow relatively, because on the tarmac there's more chance of hitting something and you falling over and cracking your head on somebody else's head or whatever. Whatever movements you feel when you're up there at cruising altitude at 550 miles an hour is air pockets and bumps and changes in direction. And when the plane accelerates or decelerates, that's what you feel. You don't feel movement. The human body never has and never will feel movement. Now, getting back to the relativity of speed, it's another thing that flat earthers just don't understand. I don't know how many times I've heard them say, well, if the earth is spinning, you should be able to take a helicopter and just lift off the ground and hover and wait for the ground to move under you. And if you're at the equator in an hour, you just hover for an hour and you'll be 1,000 miles away. No. That's not how this works. The only motion of that helicopter that is relevant in that scenario is motion relative to the earth. And when you take off, you're moving right along with the earth. And nothing changes that just because you take off. You're still moving with the earth. You know, the space shuttle used to orbit the earth at 17,500 miles an hour. And used to dock with the International Space Station that's up there moving at that speed and everything. And they'd both be traveling at this breakneck speed, and they'd slowly close in on each other and dock. And it seemed, these astronauts went through a lot of training to do that. It seemed to us watching it that it was effortless. That's because the only movement that was relative or that was relevant to those two vehicles is their movement relative to each other. And if they're moving toward each other at a couple of miles an hour, it doesn't matter that they're going the same direction at 17,500 or whatever. Their only movement that's relative is that's relevant is their movement relative to each other. And flat earthers will say, well, that's ridiculous. Have you ever tried it? Well, if you tried it on Earth, the problem is you're traveling through air, and you're going to have wind and all that interfering with you. You don't have that out in space. You don't have the issue of the wind, and so these two objects can a lot more easily travel together like this. So anytime you hear a flat earther talking about this movement, a movement of the stars and the movement of the planets and the movement of all this, and how their opinion seems to debunk reality, just bear in mind that they don't understand how movement actually works. Because you got to be moving relative to something. Before you can really talk about how fast you're going with any meaning, you have to be talking about how fast you're going relative to another object. There's a lot of fun to be had out there on YouTube, folks. And there's a lot of charlatans out there that have monetized channels, and they're getting paid to feed you bull about the flat earth. They don't believe it, most of them. Most of them are smart enough that they know it's not true. But they're cashing in, selling you snake oil. Don't fall for the snake oil, folks.